Hello once again. So I'll be talking about the Devdutt Patnaik school of thought. So he's a renowned public intellectual, a mythologist, a prolific writer who has produced books and essays on various religious and social issues, especially pertaining to India and Hinduism. Writes for a large number of columns of various important media outlets like Scroll, Dailyo, Times of India, Midday. He has authored over 50 books, many of which are bestsellers. He's an accomplished artist, and he has created the artwork for most of his books. Interesting artwork. He also provides training and guidance in areas of Indian approaches to management and leadership based on what he calls Hindu mythology. And in fact, one of his books is suggested reading for the civil services, UPSC. He is considered modern day authority on Indian culture and Hinduism and received a lot of accolade and praise. At the same time, his work has been criticized by scholars and practitioners of Hinduism alike for factual errors, for distorting important philosophical ideas, and for generally portraying Hinduism in a poor light. He has also been criticized for some of his rather derogatory remarks towards his detractors. But in this essay, I will examine his positions on some of his academic positions, as well as the objections which others have raised, and present some responses from within the tradition. So in the next few slides, I just look at five of his key academic positions, which I feel are important in explaining some of his more controversial comments. So the first claim that he makes is that there are no nations. He does not subscribe to the concept of nationhood, and its associated symbolisms like sovereignty, flag, national anthem. So these are all tools to reinforce the myth of a nation state. He does not subscribe to the idea of one India. Anyone insisting so is a fascist. And he says that there have been historically many Indias, depending on who is defining it, and that continues to be the case. The third claim is that Hinduism is not a majority religion, rather, it is the religion of the so called upper caste. It is a rather recent, elitist upper caste hegemonic enterprise which has used violence and intimidation to dominate other castes and communities. His fourth claim is that violence is endemic to Hinduism, and he gives the example of the invasion of Malaysia by the naval fleet of the Tamil Chola Empire in the 13th century. And he traces the violent nature of Hinduism to Vedic scriptures. Last claim which I have put here is that he does not subscribe to the idea of absolute truth. So this is a summary of his position which I've put here. He has more academic positions, but I've just taken five for the purpose of this presentation. Now his lens, as Rajiv had mentioned. So in one of his videos, he clearly describes his lens in a very succinct manner. So the lens he uses is that of mythology and postmodernism, a combination of these two, which you can probably see in this Patnaik 2018. It's cited there. We'll have just a quick look at myth and postmodernism. Just give a very brief survey of the literature, and that will explain how he arrives at his different conclusions. So, myth in general has a pejorative sense. Traditionally, it has been used to describe the non-West's understanding of its past. So, it is associated with fantasy, starting from the time of Hegel, with the ideas of fantasy, backwardness. I've given some of the popular definitions from academia. Then, its foreignness, the idea of the supernatural, heroic people, monsters and heroes and exotic adventures. There are more definitions, but generally this is the theme across, if you do a survey of the academic literature. So thus, this is applicable to Hinduism. So you have serials on History Channel like Ancient Aliens, Vishnu's Guided Missile. So Ramayana and Mahabharata are considered as myths. Ram is mythical. But the same thing is not applicable to, say, Christianity and Islam. So they are considered historical. So Jesus is considered a real figure. There are numerous documentaries on Jesus, his life, the places he has visited. So there's the same History Channel, the one which produces documentaries on the myths of different Hindu figures. So a quick look now at postmodernism. So postmodernism emerged essentially as a reaction against the philosophical assumptions of modernity. And in Western intellectual thought, rejection of Enlightenment ideals, truth is neither universal nor the outcome of liberation. Reason and truth are totalizing meta narratives, and hence it is to be rejected. So, ostensibly, it attacks the very idea of monolithic universals and instead encourages multiplicity of narratives in the form of little narratives. That is one of the key assumptions of postmodernism. In the chapter, I've cited the literature, so for your reference, you can please have a look at that. However, as many scholars have pointed out, it emerged as a response to Eurocentric hegemony and not necessarily to universalism per se. It opposed the universality of assumed by the white male heterosexual Western viewpoint, and in a way, it is actually a Western solution to Western problem, which uses a Western map of categories. If we want to be very specific, and Patnaik uses these ideas of truth, power, meta narratives, and earlier ideas we saw in the idea of myth, backwardness, and primitivity in his analysis of Hinduism, India, and India's past. So, in this case, he applies incorrectly, I would say, a postmodern critique of the Western universals onto the spiritual domain instead of instead of being a critique of culture and society. So what this means is that essentially the West has transcended the myths of the primitive past. Traditional society, like India, still cling to them and consider it the living tradition. To sum it up, basically the world has moved on except the Hindus. It is it is frozen in a state of moral degeneracy, and Patnaik's role in all this is to look from the outside, an ethic point of view, and make sense of the stories of Hindus for the Hindus. So essentially, he is trying to liberate Hindus from the shackles of Hinduism. That is how I interpret his work. And how does he do so? So he provides an outsider perspective using Western social models. And I'll give an example. So if you look at this in 2020, he cites, he uses the term polytheistic paganism in the context of Advaita Vedanta. He uses that term. Now, both these terms, polytheism and paganism, are derogatory terms which have been accepted in mainstream academia itself. So they are Judeo-Christian in origin as well as connotation. Like I've given some examples like pejorative sense and overtones of inferior and the commonplace. And similarly, polytheism is associated with evil and demonism. Now, in terms of interpretation of Hindu texts, typically it has been a very serious academic endeavor. The word of a qualified person with adhikar who has undergone systematic training under the guidance of a guru is considered more authentic than others. And any new interpretation should be based on the idea of Praman Shastra or the Indian epistemology system. So, postmodernism, in a sense, rejects adhikar and also does away with the need of Pramana Shastra itself. So, this allows Patnaik to reinterpret without recourse to pre existing knowledge parampara of various sampradayas. And with this background, now let us look at some of his the question that he had on Hinduism and India, some of his claims. So it is true that India as a nation state in the modern sense of the term did not exist until recently. But that does not mean that India as a civilizational state, subsuming all clans, tribes, kingdoms, never existed. It has manifested in many ways through rivers, through geographic markers like the various Tirthasthals, the Kumbh Mela, the Jyotirlingas, the Shakti Peeth. In fact, in West Bengal, when we do the puja, those who do it, so there's a Jalashuddhi process where they talk about the seven rivers. Gangesha, Yamuna, Chaiva, Godavari, Saraswati, Narmada, Sindhu, Kaveri, Jalasmin, Sandhinam, Kuru. So all the seven rivers are talked in that. So Indians by and large have had a good idea of the geography of India. When Darius I or Megasthenes, when they came to India, so they were clear that they were visiting India and not some amorphous South Asia. So they never said South Asia or something, but they had a clear idea what India meant. On Hinduism, yeah, it is true that again that the term Hindu as a self-identifier was first used maybe in the second millennia. I mean, sometime post 1000 CE it was used, but that does not mean that Hindus had no idea about who they were as a person. The earliest references happen in the Zend Avesta of the Zoroastrians. So when the Islamic world also understood this difference very well between Hind and Hindu, or Hindustan and Hindu, and when they meant Hindu, they specifically referred to those who were Indians but non-Abrahamic. So this included Jains, Buddhists, tribals, all the different so-called castes. Everybody came into that. And today, ironically, or the same definition is used. That has been the self-understanding. The same definition has been used even today in the various acts, whether it's the Hindu Marriage Act or different acts of the government. In a definition like in a country like India, see, people have the freedom of speech, including the freedom to have any views on what Hinduism or India means. But for somebody who is considered an authority figure on Hinduism and India, he should take a clear stand that, okay, this is what India means and this is what Hinduism means, and I accept this definition. So he doesn't do that, and that is like a company CEO who criticizes the very product he's supposed to sell. It is similar to that. Now that we know his lens and where he's coming from, the mythology plus postmodern lens, so this gives us a clue on why he sees themes of power, violence, and intolerance everywhere. So he says that Hinduism is inherently violent and at perpetual war with Jainas and Buddhas, that even within Hinduism there was constant strife between different sects all the time. So he plays up the schism between different Hindu communities. He subscribes to the view that wars led to migrations, the migrations of Brahmins from north to south. So he's not clear whether to call that a invasion or an immigration. He characterizes the Advaita darshana as political, given its association with Hindutva. I mean, that is his understanding. And essentially, what this means is he sees Hinduism as a melting pot of all kind of evils that we see in India today. Although he might appear to be a proponent of the Hindu view in through the lens of mythology, it doesn't appear to be that way when one does a deeper, takes a deeper look at his at all his academic positions. So, see, I've touched upon why his interpretation of Hindu texts sometimes differs so radically from the traditional interpretations. Essentially, to put things in a from the Indian perspective, his view is a Gnostic view, masquerading as the insider Astic view. So, Gnostic and Astic in this sense means those who accept the Veda as Shabda Praman and those who don't, like the Jains and Buddhas are the Gnostic view. So, he is a Charvak. We may call him a Charvak. So, he is basically a Charvak who is has become the lead spokesperson for Hinduism, something which would have been unthought of. I mean, you couldn't have thought of such a thing maybe even 500 years back. So that is it. I mean, the purpose of writing this essay is to basically open up dialogue on these various non-traditional interpretation of Hindu texts between experts and people from the social sciences. And I hope I have somehow achieved that this purpose. Thank you very much.
Namawa. I'm pleased to offer my views on the chapter on Devdutt Patnaik in the just being released book, 10 Heads of Ravana. This chapter has been read by, has been authored by Shubhodeep Mukhopadhyay, and I must congratulate him for the thorough study he has done of Devdutt Patnaik's writings, tweets, articles, books, and presented a Purva Paksha with many references from Indian and Western works to corroborate his critique of what he calls Devdattology. 6 years back, I had written an article on the book My Gita by Devdutt Patnaik, and the title of the article was not just his Gita, it's Patnaik's own fantasy world. And the study of that fantasy world is probably Devdattology. So, deconstructing Devdattology, an apt title for this chapter. As Shubhati points out, Devdutt Patnaik is immensely popular. He continues to be. He's authored over 50 books, many of which are bestsellers. And he's considered a modern day authority on Hinduism. In my personal experience, and I've covered this in ample detail in my talks and articles, I find Devdutt's writings to be very shallow. They have a very superficial understanding of Hindu scriptures, of Hindu works and Hindu traditions, and a lot of distortions. Shubhadeep begins with what Devdutt talks about when he discusses dharma. So he contrasts the definitions of dharma as given in the Mahabharata, which says dharanat dharma ityahu. So dharma is what sustains the society. And look at Devdutt's definition of dharma. So what Devdutt says is that dharma has been made out to be a complicated word. That way you can call anything dharma. Dharma is potential, the best of what anything or anyone can do, which is such a distorted definition of dharma. And what I particularly liked about Shubhadeep's critique is somebody who's, what about somebody like a terrorist who's realizing his full potential? Will you call it dharma? Of course not. So, such a definition of dharma is just a figment of Devdutt's imagination. As Shubhadeep rightly mentions, potential is not a standard definition, is not found in any of the major Sanskrit dictionaries. No Sanskrit dictionary gives potential as a meaning of dharma. And things like these, for example, Patnaik says, neither violence nor non-violence is dharma. Dharma is a thought, not an action. Again, as Shubhadeep rightly mentions, only violence in specific circumstances. For example, when Krishna exhorted Arjuna to fight the Kurukshetra war for the sake of dharma, only that is dharma. Otherwise, it is ahimsa paramo dharma, as the Mahabharata puts it. Ahimsa, non-violence, is a supreme dharma. To ignore this nuance and dumb it down to saying things like neither violence nor non-violence is dharma is very typical of Devdutt Patnaik. There are things which need to be simplified, but simplification is not dumbing down. And what Devdutt Patnaik does is to dumb down things for his audience, his gallery, which is as Shubhadeep rightly mentions on page 118, the English-speaking urban Hindu elites who have a superficial knowledge of Hindu darshanas and sampradayas. That's the target audience that Devdutt has. And unfortunately, this is a growing audience, and it is our duty to reach out to them with critiques like these, with Purva Paksha analysis like these in English. Shubhadeep further mentions things like Patnaik agrees with the view that Lord Rama's obsession with rules dehumanized him. And look at the kind of language that Devdutt uses. That Ram always follows the rule makes him dependable. You know what to expect from him. That's a good quality too. It also means that around him there'll be Sitas who'll suffer. There's such a perfunctory reading, such a shallow reading of our texts, all nuance gone in his HRD driven approach, as Shubhadeep mentions. Further down in the chapter, Shubhadeep talks about pramanas, and he mentions what Devdutt calls myth. And an important thing that Shubhadeep brings out is that we never talk about Christian myths. We never talk about, and I can add from my experience, we never talk about Muslim myths. For example, splitting of the moon or Muhammad's journey on a winged steed. They are never talked about in terms of as Islamic myths, but it's always Hindu myths. If you look at Buddhism, even Buddhist texts have supernatural feats. For example, the Ambatta Suttam in the Tipitaka mentions that Buddha had 32 marks of a realized person, fully realized person. And two of them he displayed to Ambatta. One of them I can't talk about right now. It has to be read. The other one is that Buddha had such a long tongue that he showed that mark to Ambatta by stretching out his tongue, touching both the ears, both the nostrils, and then covering his forehead. So, such supernatural feats, and we find a lot of them in the Buddhist lore, in the Tipitaka, in the Mahayana tradition, but they are never talked about as Buddhist myths. The narrative is that Buddhism is a rational religion and Hinduism is a religion full of myths, and that narrative is also furthered by Devdutt Patnaik and other similar writers. So, as Shubhadeep says, Patnaik does not see the continuity between the past and present when it comes to analyzing Hinduism solely through the lens of mythology. Then on nationhood, so Devdutt Patnaik says that ideas such as nation state are secular myths. nation states are secular myths. I'm not sure how many of our own countrymen would agree with it. Uh, India or Bharat has been a civilizational state for a long time, and it has been recognized as a geographical state also. When Megasthenes wrote Indica, he was referring to a geographical entity as a civilizational state. So Devdutt writes things like, when somebody imagines one idea of India, they're really not scientific. They are poets with the control freak trait. And Shubhadeep then critiques this, that when Darius the First talked about India, or when Megasthenes talked about India in his Indica, they were referring to a civilizational state. Another gem from Devdutt: Indian culture is like a masala box. This is the kind of dumbing down that Devdutt Patnaik is very good at. Something as profound, as deep, as ancient as Indian culture, as serious a topic, has been compared to a masala box. Because probably that's what Devdutt can think about. It's a masala box. It's for people who want to watch masala movies, who want to read masala books, who want to read masala philosophy. This is the perfect masala author. Indian culture is like a masala box. And then he says indigenous challenges such as rise of Buddhism. So I don't know where this confusion comes from, that Buddhism was an indigenous challenge. No, Buddhism was as much Arya as it could be. In fact, the Buddha himself said his way is the Arya Magga, or the Arya Marga. He said that uh, in fact, one of the meanings of the word Arya is a Buddhist, as per standard dictionaries. So, the concept of Arya Magga or Arya Dhamma, the Arya Dharma or the Arya Marg, is very much present in Buddhism. Pali or Ardhamagadi, or Ardhamagadi of the Jainas, or Magadhi of Buddha, which is often referred to as Pali, are languages which are very similar to Sanskrit. Somebody who knows Sanskrit can easily understand Pali and Magadhi and Ardha Magadhi. These are very similar languages. The concept of Arya is very much present in Buddhism. So, why is it an indigenous challenge to the dominant Aryans? Why is it presented like that? In fact, Buddhism has the same. In fact, even untouchability is accepted by Buddhism. We have Buddhist suttas talking about Hinakulas, the low families or the low clans. For example, the Chandalas, the Venukaras, the Rathakaras, the Pulkasas. So, when it comes to caste, there have been scholarly studies which say that both from India and abroad, which state with proofs that the Buddha did not denounce caste as we believe today, as a lot of people believe today. In fact, he accepted the caste is not the right word to use, but he accepted the varna or the kula vyavastha. He in fact proposed an alternative interpretation where he placed the kshatriyas above the brahmins, and there were some hina kulas or hina jatis who were considered inferior, even in the writings of Buddha, even in the Tipitaka, even in the Mahayana works. So, all these things are known in the scholarly world. Unfortunately, we have a lot of uh, shallow readings and misunderstandings prevalent in popular culture, and Devdutt Patnaik is one example. Further, Shubhadeep brings about the Brahmin phobia or Brahmin misia of Devdutt Patnaik, where he blames Brahmins for making the system rigid. And in Patnaik's works, the Brahmins dehumanized people, denied them human dignity and access to common resources like water and education. So, all the blame of all the caste system, or so-called caste system, because caste is not the exact translation of varna or jati, but all the ills of the caste hierarchy, or the varna hierarchy, or jati hierarchy, and the discrimination are blamed on, are put on, all the blame is put on Brahmins, whereas many scholarly writings have pointed out that this was a social construct. This was a construct present even in the Harappan civilization, and even in Buddhism. To blame just the Brahmins for the jati or varna vyavastha is a very shallow and narrow-minded view. In fact, an agenda-driven view, if I would to put it mildly. Now, passport to distort. There's an interesting section where Shubhodip points out the distortions of Devdutt Patnaik. Another thing is where he confounds Hindutva, Hinduism, and Advaita. For example, as Shubhodip mentioned on page 137, at one place Devdutt mentions that Advaita Vedanta is the de facto philosophy followed by Hindutva. And then he says that Advaita Vedanta is the foundation of Hinduism. That's a relatively new idea with thinkers like Dayanand Saraswati. So at one point he equates, at one place he equates Advaita Vedanta with Hindutva. At one point he equates Advaita Vedanta with Hinduism as a relatively new thought. Mentions Dayanand Saraswati, who does not subscribe to Advaita, by the way. And then he says that Hinduism is not Hindutva, but both are Advaita Vedanta. So all this is immense confusion. As Shubhodip rightly mentions, Advaita is one of the many streams thriving in the Hindu ecosystem, and non-dualism is seen in numerous sampradayas, including different post-Shankara Vedanta schools, such as Kashmir Shaivism and many tantric schools. So all this nuance is gone, and we have a masala mix of Devdattology served to you. So Shubhodip then mentions things like Kadru and Vinata. So reading conflict in Kadru and Vinata, that's I think Devdutt reads a lot in many things. So all that is pointed out effectively. I'm impressed with the number of references that Shubhodip has cited. It's a well-written chapter, and the core texts of, for example, I've been cited, and when I've said that when Devdutt Patnaik talks about the Gita, he has trivialized the core text, one of the core texts of Hindu philosophy, to a deficient caricature. I wrote this 6 years ago. I stand by it even today, every word of it, and Shubhodip cites it at the end of his chapter. So we will conclude with the pitfalls of blindly believing Devdutt Patnaik, and that's what this chapter brings out successfully. I wish this book all the success and good and wide readership that it deserves. This chapter number 4, Devdutt Patnaik, Deconstructing Devdattology by Shubhodip Mukhopadhyay. I've read it end to end, from the beginning to the last word. I've gone through the references. It's a well-written chapter, and I hope this gets the wide audience it deserves. With that, I conclude my address. Namo.